1983, West London. 25-year-old Jackie Poole is assaulted and strangled to death in her own home.
It was such a nasty murder.
Despite a thorough police investigation, there's just not enough evidence to convict a killer. A local psychic believes she is visited by the victim's vengeful spirit. In a supernatural trance, she is taken back to the murder scene.
And I could see it as plain as anything. It was Porky.
But what part would her visions of the name Pokey and a brown sweater play in solving this brutal crime?
I could feel Jackie saying to me, ring them now.
Would a psychic's paranormal powers or hard forensic science nail Jackie's killer? Saturday, the 12th of February, 1983. Ruislip, a busy suburb 17 miles west of central London. Local psychic Christine Holohan's sixth sense has been on high alert all weekend.
I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. A feeling of coldness in the room. I'd hear footsteps, I'd sort of hear the door opening and closing. It was a sense of feeling of gloom. I was wondering what was happening. This was extremely intense.
Was Christine's psychic experience connected to the incredible events that were about to be played out? The next day, a concerned friend of Jacqueline Poole contacts the police. The recently separated shop assistant hasn't been seen for 2 days and isn't answering her phone. A young police constable and the father of Jackie's boyfriend break in to discover that the popular 25-year-old has been sexually assaulted and strangled. Heading up the investigation team is Detective Superintendent Tony Lundy.
Well, first of all, there was no forced entry to the premises. So she'd let somebody in or they'd con their way in. There were no broken windows, doors or anything. So it seemed pretty obvious it's somebody who she associates with.
Jackie has been strangled to death with a cord. Personal items have been stolen and her clothing is in disarray.
She was fanatical at wearing rings and necklaces and bracelets and stuff, but basically the lot had gone. I think there may have been something left on her finger that couldn't come off, but everything that could be removed had gone.
Jackie's body has lain undiscovered for some 48 hours. The killer has a head start. Police begin to interview Jackie's friends and family for vital clues and release details of the attack to the press.
It became obvious from a very early stage that it was going to be a difficult investigation because the fact there'd been no break into the premises, we were really looking at close connections. Her husband had left her some time before, so obviously he was a possibility as a suspect from the word go, and numerous names were flooding in really from the outset.
The night after the body is discovered, just 3 miles away, Christine Holohan claims her psychic abilities are put to the test once again.
And after a while, I could see them like starting to appear, and they start to get bigger, and eventually there was like a shape. And from the shape, I could see the outline of a young woman. She seemed very agitated and very sort of frustrated, and I sort of said, like, I'm going to take a chance here. So I said, are you the young lady that's been murdered? And so I said, is it Jackie Poole? And she said, Jackie Hunt.
Why is the spirit calling herself Jackie Hunt, and what connection does she have with the murder victim?
So I asked her, how did she want me to help her? So she told me that she knew who had murdered her. And I explained to her that I would have to have solid evidence. I couldn't go to the police and just say somebody appeared to me and said they were murdered. I had to be able to go to the police with something positive. And then all of a sudden, then she went. And I thought, oh, that's it, she's gone. I was anxious of going to the police in case I would give them information that they would think I got from other sources or from a paper.
Christine is desperate for more clues. Amazingly, the spirit returns the following night.
It was like I was watching a television scene. It's like I flashed onto another level. It was then that I felt I was taken on a journey. I was just feeling what she was feeling. I felt myself in this flat, and I got a terrible sense of feeling that I was being dragged in slow motion as if she was still going through it. And it was horrible. And I could see all the struggle, and I could see what was happening.
Christine believes she is a psychic witness to murder and sees a woman called Jackie Hunt being attacked by a young man. She claims she is shown the layout of the victim's home. It's not much to go on, but she cannot ignore the spirit's pleas for justice.
I started, realizing what she'd gone through and thought, if I go to the police and I leave myself open to the person who actually murdered her, I started to think of lots of things. You're going to protect yourself. I was a bit afraid.
Christine is desperate to describe what she has seen to the police. But murder investigation teams are skeptical over the use of psychics, and she must risk ridicule.
I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to ring them, but I also knew that she just was not going to go away. So it's like she was my friend now. She wasn't just that she was a victim who came to me looking for help. She was like she was now my friend. Eventually, I could feel Jackie saying to me, ring them now. I could hear it really plain in my ears, ring them now.
While the psychic builds up courage to call the police with crucial information, the murder investigation team work around the clock to nail the killer.
You don't often get called out to scenes of murder where a young lady has been beaten, strangled, and it was a very, very nasty crime scene.
With no sign of a break-in, police investigate the theory that Christine knew her killer.
She had many, many friends, all from a same age group, from being brought up in the area and so on. And we had to eliminate over 70 suspects. Many you could eliminate quickly, but many, many, many were explored at length, and that made it very difficult.
Christine Holohan claims she has visions of the murder sent to her by a spirit called Jackie Hunt. The local psychic feels she can no longer ignore the ghost's pleas for help and risks ridicule by contacting the police.
I must admit I'm not one who's much of a believer in that, but at the same time, obviously, any possibilities to help you, you're going to explore them.
Constables Andrew Smith and Tony Batters are sent to interview the psychic. Unknown to Christine, Tony Batters was the first police officer at the murder scene. Sadly, Tony passed away in 2003. His widow, Anne, remembers the day that would change his life forever.
I think it could well have been the first time he'd actually found a victim. And she was young. It was a horrific murder. Because he had been the first officer on the scene and had actually stayed at the scene for several hours, he knew the layout, what the situation was in the flat, things that had been broken or turned over or something that was out of place. He believed there would be nobody else who would know that detail other than himself.
If Christine's claims were true, then convincing this hardened skeptic with first-hand knowledge of the crime scene would be a major challenge.
I thought, oh God, here goes. And I was tuning it out with Jackie. I hope you're here. I really hope you're here at this stage. And she was. She went to explain everything that she could possibly explain. She went to as much details as she could possibly give me. I explained that when she came through, I asked her, was she Jackie Poole? And she said Jackie Hunt.
The psychic's first piece of information is a hit. Tony Batters knows that Jackie Poole's maiden name is Hunt. They are the same woman.
Maybe I was hitting on something, but I didn't know what it was. I hadn't got a clue. She showed me around the house. She explained exactly where everything was.
Christine claims she is transported back to the crime scene and is able to see 2 cups in the kitchen, prescription forms, and a black address book. Amazingly, this tallies with what Tony has seen at Jackie's flat less than a week earlier. These details were not released to the press after the murder.
And I could see where she was lying, and I could see her hand. There was 2 rings in particular he couldn't get off her hand.
Jackie's missing jewelry was reported in the local papers, but nothing specific had been mentioned about the 2 rings that had been left on her body.
She also sort of was very insistent that there was a jumper that he was going to be thrown away. And she said, it's important to get this jumper because if you don't, she said, it's going to be gone.
Christine claims that she never met Jackie or any of her acquaintances when she was alive. But during her trance, she uses the names of many of Jackie's friends and family. One name is a mystery.
She mentioned Barbara Stone, and she didn't give me any significance on the name, but I said, anything she gives me, I'll take on board.
No one on the investigation has ever heard of Barbara Stone. Despite the puzzling name, Tony is amazed by the psychic's insight.
At this point, he said, ask Jackie to describe her killer. And she explained he's 23. He had a birthday April or May, in Taurus. He had dark hair, dark skin. He had tattoo.
Christine seems to give the police officers a profile of the murderer. But nothing would be more useful than a name.
So I said I would just very quietly go into a trance. I really had to tune in very, very strong with Jackie. I'd really bring her into me close. And I could feel her. It was like as if she actually really came through, as if she was inside of me.
The psychic resorts to a technique called remote writing, which unlocks her unconscious. She hopes this psychic skill will reveal the all-important name.
Jackie helped me spell out the name. She'd actually got the attention of the police, and this was it. And I could see it as plain as anything. It was Porky. I knew at that point I had actually hit something significant had happened, though he never actually quite said anything about it.
Over 20 years later, Christine Holohan returns to the room where she used a paranormal technique called remote writing to reveal a name of a killer.
No, it was like as if somebody had taken my hand and very, very slowly had actually written out the name, very slowly. And then it started to come up. The minute I'd written it, it came up very clear. And so we got Pokey. She said it was a nickname. It's a nickname. He's known as a nickname. And I can remember Tony saying to me, Pokey, are you sure? And I said, that's what, and I showed him. And he seemed quite taken back when he looked at what I'd written. It was like as if I'd sort of touched on a nerve.
The name Pokey sends shivers down the spine of the two detectives. It is the nickname of Anthony Ruark. He is a friend of Jackie's boyfriend and is well known by the victim. Ruark is already amongst the murder team's prime suspects and has already been questioned.
Well, I felt I'd done all I could possibly do, and I got a sense of feeling from Jackie as if she sort of was saying to me, look, if that's not convinced him, what is going to convince him?
That same day, Tony Batters returns to the murder squad convinced by the psychic's abilities.
He was just amazed, totally amazed that she could have that sort of information.
Now, Tony must persuade the rest of his team to trust the testimony of a ghost.
I'd said to Batters that she was telling us something that she'd heard from the locals, and she didn't have any information whatsoever that could assist us on the inquiry at all.
During the attack, Jackie had jewelry stolen. It is crucial in the hunt for her killer.
And my attitude was that when she can tell us where the jewelry is or something conclusive to assist us, then I'll believe in mediums. But at this stage, just don't waste my time.
The police discount the work of the psychic and set about extracting the truth from Pokey.
Not the easiest person to obviously break down, especially when you're interviewing them about a very, very horrible, serious murder. But the officers who did interview him were fairly convinced that he was involved. The difficulty was being convinced, and finding evidence to back it up is another matter.
Christine had told Tony Batters that Jackie's killer is a Taurus in his early 20s and that he is dark-haired, dark-skinned with tattoos. Amazingly, this corresponds with Pokey's profile. The spirit of Jackie was desperate to draw attention to a sweater. Police have already retrieved this vital clue. DCI Norman McKinley was to become closely involved with Jackie's case.
During the search of Tony O'Rourke's house and in a dustbin, they found a jumper. This jumper was submitted to the forensic laboratory, and of course, fibres having come from Jacqueline's clothing and also plaster particles, which was also found on Jacqueline's clothing, was also found on this jumper.
The evidence forensically links Pokey with Jackie, but the murder suspect has an explanation.
The problem that the police had was that Rourke knew Jackie. He did say that he had spoken to her during the week prior to her death, so contact had been made then.
Despite a psychic pointing the finger at Pokey and the police suspecting this known criminal, after a 15-month investigation, the team is shut down.
We have this evidence, we have that evidence, but it was never, ever going to be sufficient at that time to instigate a prosecution. So that was the low point, but closing it down when the family still had no solution to it was very, very disappointing.
Tony Batter's appeals to work with the psychic are ignored. Now he has to deal with the investigation team being disbanded.
Oh, he was very frustrated because they obviously had done a lot of work and they thought that they had enough evidence.
Christine believes Jackie is devastated that her killer walks free.
She was so angry in the sense that he walked away from the murder as if he had absolutely no feelings either way.
The psychic remains frustrated by the police skepticism.
I done the very best I could possibly do. I gave him the information. I trusted the information that Jackie gave me was accurate, and I knew there was nothing else I could really do. I always somehow believed that there would be justice someday. I just didn't know when.
Christine is certain the unsolved murder will be reinvestigated, and it is. In 1999, some 15 years after the main inquiry was shut down, Christine has another visitation from a troubled spirit.
And I could see an image of a blonde-haired woman. And I kept looking and I kept thinking that it looked like Jackie, but I said, I must be imagining this. Couldn't understand what the significance of that would be.
Unknown to the psychic, the police reinvestigate the 16-year-old murder case after an informant brings in new leads on a suspect that is not Pokey. Was the apparition a coincidence, or Jackie trying to let Christine know that the hunt for her killer had started again? In the intervening years, a cutting-edge DNA technology had been developed that should allow police to test forensic evidence taken from Jackie's flat 16 years ago.
The introduction of DNA low copy number, or LCN, was completely new. The DNA technology in 2001 and even today is very accurate, so much that the forensic scientists can identify one person in a billion from a DNA profile. We had every opportunity now to solve a murder, and particular for the benefit of Jacqueline's family, to ensure that justice was done for them.
Bodily fluids collected from the crime scene and skin extracted from under Jackie's nails are examined by forensic scientists. But the new DNA technology will take 12 months to deliver the results. The wait is agonizing.
I got a telephone call from the Home Office laboratory, and I couldn't believe it, that the bodily swab had produced a full profile.
Is Pokey the killer?
The DNA LCN match, the full profile, came down to Tony Rourke, who also was known as Pokey.
Amazingly, the results tally with the name that had been scrawled on a notepad by psychic Christine Holohan over 17 years ago.
He was arrested on Wednesday, the 24th of May, in a car park in Cirencester. He was arrested for the murder of Jacqueline Poole.
Pokey is stunned to discover that he is being arrested for a crime that he was certain he'd walked away from. And in August 2001, he is tried at the Old Bailey in London.
We've suspected him all these years, and now at last, hopefully, he's going to get his comeuppance and go away for a long, long time. Everybody was hoping that the verdict was going to go the right way. I was with, obviously, the brothers of the victim, and I mean, the evidence had been very strong, but you can never be 100% sure with juries. So they were very, very anxious and very, very, wary of the verdict.
Tony Batters attends the 2-week trial. The retired police officer had listed 130 specific points that Christine claimed she received from Jackie's spirit. Now, he wanted to see just how many were correct.
I think it would have been really that he needed to know for himself. He had to prove it for himself. But the amount of information that Christine did give, if that was available to other murder inquiries, then obviously it would be very valuable.
According to Tony's notes, an amazing 120 facts match information brought out during the trial, including personal details about Jackie, the layout of the crime scene, and how Jackie knew her killer.
Although Christine lived locally, she didn't know Jackie, she didn't know her family, she didn't know her circle of friends at all. But it's just in the amount of detail that she gave, and most of it was proven to be correct.
The new DNA evidence is used to establish Pokey was at Jackie's flat on the day of the murder. The plaster particles taken from the brown pullover that Jackie had told Christine about are also produced as evidence.
The jumper, which had been retained by police in a sealed bag from 1983, was produced in evidence at Rourke's trial and played a significant part.
Pokey amends his story and claims he visited Jackie on the night of the murder, but that she was alive when he left. The solid prosecution evidence challenges this, and after 2 weeks, the jury is unanimously convinced of Pokey's guilt, and he is sentenced to life imprisonment. Justice at last for Jackie's family.
And when eventually the guilty verdict was brought in, they were absolutely over the moon. I mean, they were virtually shouting out in joy.
There is one final twist in the tale. The mysterious name, Barbara Stone, given to police by Christine nearly 20 years ago, becomes another psychic hit.
During the Old Bailey trial, Tony was sitting next to one of Jackie's brothers, and he asked him, did the name Barbara Stone mean anything? And he said, well, yes, of course, it was Jackie's best friend, but she had been killed in a road accident about a year or two before Jackie had been killed. So that was the answer to the name.
Christine's involvement in the Jackie Poole case hits the headlines. Her psychic skills have converted Tony Batters into a true believer.
She'd have had to be pretty good. He thought the information must have come directly from Jackie, because there was no other way that Christine would have had the detail of information that she had given the police.
Christine receives one final visit from her old friend.
And she was smiling, and she had found happiness, and she seemed to have, she was a different person than I'd seen 18 years earlier. I felt very happy that she had found peace, and I sort of felt sad, because I felt like this was closure all around. Jackie was gone.
This extraordinary relationship had spanned nearly 2 decades.
She was very, very special. She'll be always a very special part of my life, one way or another.
A young mother disappears without a trace in Lake Oswego, Oregon. She's had a fight with her husband and walked out. She's missing, and so is the family car. Police suspect the husband. A local psychic's visions reveal there's been a murder. But will a partnership between the psychic and the cop put the killer behind bars? March 31st, 1986. The police in Lake Oswego, a wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, get a call from 28-year-old John Burke. He reports that after a late-night argument, his wife, Alexis, left in the family car. She hasn't been seen for 3 days. Local detective Robert Lee is assigned to the case.
At that point in time, we didn't really know for sure that a crime had even been committed. I mean, let's face it, couples split up. I mean, it happens every day. They have arguments. One or the other will take the family car and leave.
But that theory just doesn't fit this situation.
In this case, there was also a 1.5-year-old child that had Down syndrome, and it would be extremely unusual for any mother to leave her child. Alexis was a very beautiful woman. She was a person that would never stay gone for more than a few hours at a time.
Lee and his investigators suspect the husband is being less than truthful about what happened 3 days earlier.
John Burke was lying to me through his teeth. His reactions were real bad. His physiological responses did not match what he was saying. And my impression was that whatever happened to Alexis, John was responsible for it. And I went back and essentially knocked on the man's door to interview him. And I asked him if it was okay if the crime lab could take a look at the apartment. He said yes, and I signaled for the crime lab to come in, and we conducted our interview outside the apartment while the crime lab did their work on the inside.
They found nothing suspicious, so they focus on finding the car that John Burke claims Alexis drove off in.
We reasonably expected that if we found the car, we were going to find Alexis.
Driven by increasing concern and frustrated at the lack of progress in the investigation, Alexis's mother takes an unusual step. A family friend recommends she call psychic Laurie McQuarrie. Over the phone, Laurie immediately gets impressions about a very violent encounter.
The very first sense I got, even without a picture, just hearing Alexis's name, I felt that she was gone. I felt that very strongly. It's like a heaviness right in the middle of my chest. I described Alexis, her personality, which was a bit volatile, very intense. John, I thought, was lazy. I thought he was just a guy who was coasting through life, and he had absolutely no plans on changing anything.
John was essentially unemployable by anybody but his own father, because John's work habits were atrocious, to say the least. He didn't want to show up if he didn't feel like it.
I could see an argument between the husband and the wife.
Laurie's view of the night Alexis disappeared matches with what John had been telling the police, but she sees more than the argument.
What I felt with Alexis and John and the argument that I envisioned was that it was in part about finances, and a lot of people fight about finances. That's usually part of a marital situation. But this was fueled by someone being on drugs, alcohol, and I certainly felt that Alexis hadn't been using it. In fact, one of the points that I made to her mom is I said, this woman turned her life around recently. And she said, yes, that was true. And I said, well, I don't think the husband had. And I thought that he was a very weak person and that he was still using drugs, and that in itself was creating a problem in the marriage. I felt that there had been a horrific fight and that it had happened right there in the house and that she was no longer in that area.
Within 4 days, police get a break. The family car has been abandoned in a rest area. Detective Lee finds it full of clues that just don't add up.
Alexis was 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed approximately 115 pounds. She would have to be very close to the steering wheel to even reach the pedals. And yet the seat was pushed way to the back, like somebody my size or larger was actually driving the car. The ignition key was still in the ignition, and yet the doors were locked. From a police standpoint, that's what we call a proprietary interest in the car. Somebody might purposely leave the keys in, but he wants to lock the doors because he doesn't want somebody to take his car. There was an open map with a city in Washington that was circled. The fact that the map was there to begin with was disturbing because to us it felt like a setup right off the bat.
Although the car reveals unsettling information, Detective Lee knows he needs hard evidence a crime took place.
We did get a couple of dogs to search the entire rest area to see if there was perhaps a body that was around there, and came up with nothing.
Detective Lee's case has gone cold, so when he gets a call from Alexis's mother saying she's contacted a psychic, he's skeptical but willing to listen.
A police investigator really takes information, sometimes from oddball-type sources, and runs with that information just to see if that information is any good, if it can be corroborated, by another direction. I'm a left-brain thinker. I'm very good with things that I can see and touch, feel, that make reasonable sense to me. So I contacted her by phone, and I have to admit I probably was a little bit more flippant than I probably should have been.
I can remember that particular day, Detective Lee calling me and telling me that he was the detective working on the case, that he wanted to take me to lunch, and he wanted to check me out. It didn't sit well.
Detective Lee is anxious to hear what Laurie has to say and convinces her to meet him for lunch. Laurie just wants to help find Alexis's body for her family.
She told me an awful lot about my case.
I see numbers.
Laurie tells Detective Lee that she keeps seeing the number 15. He's intrigued. Alexis's car was found 15 miles from her home. Maybe that's the connection.
I watched his body language. He removed his glasses and put them on the table. And I thought, gotcha. You're interested.
Laurie has a flash of information about the car used to transport Alexis's body.
There's a larger car, older car, and as I'm almost looking at it, I'm back of it and I'm seeing the trunk lid open, and it's a huge trunk.
Detective Lee can't see the link. Alexis's car is a two-door with a small trunk, not the larger car Laurie's describing.
When you're talking about a car, a big car, spend the next 5 minutes driving the highway and you'll see 100 of them.
Laurie's next bit of info makes Lee even more skeptical.
She told me that the younger brother, Kelly, was involved. I'd interviewed Kelly. Kelly was actually playing ball for the college that he attended in Southern California at the time of the disappearance of Alexis Burke.
I can see the brother handling her body, helping carry it. I can see shovels involved, and I can see this family connection.
We checked with the college. They verified the fact that Kelly was literally over 1,000 miles away at the time. That automatically made 8 or 10 of the other things that Laurie told me couldn't possibly be true, simply because his involvement couldn't have been there.
Detective Lee's investigation contradicts many of Laurie's clues, but Laurie is sticking to her guns. If she's right, Lee could be missing some crucial evidence.
I remember telling him, it's going to be different than you think. It will bear me out. Wait and see.
Laurie decides on a dangerous path. She takes the investigation into her own hands and arranges to meet the man she believes to be the killer.
I just had to meet him.
Alexis Burke, a young mother from a suburb of Portland, appears to vanish into thin air. While police suspect her husband, John, they have no evidence a crime has been committed. Alexis's mother contacts psychic Laurie McQuarrie, hoping she'll be able to help police find her daughter. Laurie decides she has no time to waste. Alexis's husband is packing up the apartment, preparing to rent it out, so Laurie takes a risk.
I knew the minute I met him, looked in his eyes, maybe if I was even fortunate enough to shake hands with him, I would get a further impression.
The police found nothing when they searched the apartment. Now it's psychic Laurie's turn.
He answered the door. He was very laid back, and I don't know if he was on drugs or not, but he was just very calm. And of course, I pretended to be a renter. As I went through that apartment, of course, I think not just as a psychic, but I think just as another human being, I thought, where is the wife's picture? Is there nothing here? There was nothing, not a thing of hers there, nothing. And she had only been missing a couple of months, nothing.
Laurie's observations are chilling.
And I thought, how cold. You've already buried her, not only literally, but symbolically. She's gone from your life. When I turned to leave and thanked him, I shook his hands. And when I held his hand, I can just feel these around her neck. I know that's how he murdered her.
My reaction when Lori told me that she'd gone to the apartment and met John was one of utter disbelief. Here was a person that even she thought was a murderer. And I was convinced of it at that point, and yet she's going up and making contact with him in an apartment. I was very upset.
After going to the apartment, that's when I began to get stronger and stronger feelings about where she was buried.
But I still was a basic skeptic. I believe what I can see, what I can prove.
Still, he's willing to listen. Can the psychic help Detective Lee find the body?
One iota, nothing of her belongings there.
Once or twice a week, we would sit and hypothesize with each other about what I think happened here and what he thinks.
One of the things that Lori had come up with right off the bat was 1-5. She didn't know whether the 1-5 meant Interstate 5, whether it was 1.5 miles, or what the significance of the 15 was. In this case, 15 could very easily have been, we're about 15 miles from the place where we thought the death had occurred.
And there was a place called Bell's Landing.
Bell's Landing, according to Lori, was an important item as far as the relationship between John and Alexis was concerned.
Detective Lee and psychic Lori McQuarrie didn't know if they were looking for an actual place or not. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Maybe this is interesting.
Right down the way over here is where John and Alexis used to spend an awful lot of time. In Oregon, Bell's Landing could either be the side of a mountain where they park machinery when they're clear-cutting an area or doing a logging operation. It could also be a landing alongside of a river. And in this area of Oregon, we have some very, very large rivers, so it's quite plausible that there would be a landing named Bell's somewhere.
That's the frustrating part. Sometimes I get the clues, sometimes I get the symbologies, and it's up to me to make it fit. It's up to me to do the interpretation. And it isn't always like a teletype. I wish it were. We even went out on a couple of searches together in areas out as where she had lived previously, which is not very far from here. So he made the effort. He was at least cooperative and open.
You know, it's part of what I saw, but I don't think this is the spot.
So you're not actually getting any...
I'm not getting any vibes, let's put it that way.
Lori told very specifically that the body was buried.
Her head was just inches away from a little creek. I also felt that he had buried her where he could watch her.
That meant an awful lot to us, but what exactly did it mean? Did it mean he could keep an eye on it from work? Was it near his home?
And it was about that time that I was really talking to him about it's in a field, there's a building, but it's not a regular building like you would just walk in and do business in.
The more time they spend together, the more Detective Lee trusts Lori's visions. They match his own hunches about the husband.
She has an insight into people and places and things that I don't even understand.
The scenario will play out. I will see the person, I will see the circumstances. Sometimes the reception may become a little hazy. It isn't always crystal clear. It may come in and out, but it's exactly like watching a television show. I could see him eating his lunch. He goes out there, eats his lunch, and watches the site. The site is within range. He can see it. And as long as it's not disturbed, he knows he's not in trouble.
It looks like John is going to get away with murder, but Lori's psychic instincts tell her he's made a big mistake.
This was something where many people knew what had happened.
Lori is convinced John has told someone about the murder. Detective Lee rethinks the investigation and decides on a new approach.
We used an awful lot of what we would consider to be behavioral analysis on John. We knew that if we applied pressure to John, that his past history would indicate that he would talk to somebody. And yet we didn't want to put so much pressure on him that he was going to invoke his rights per Miranda, which in the United States is a pretty big thing simply because it meant that we were no longer able really to talk directly to John without the interference of an attorney.
I've always thought, you know, sometimes the best crimes in the world have been solved by the girlfriend who was dumped. And I knew that John had had a girlfriend.
Just as Lori predicted, that's exactly what happened.
A former girlfriend of John Burke was living with some girls that were attending college, and she mentioned to one of the girls that she had a former boyfriend who had killed his wife. This girl contacted another girlfriend, who talked to another girlfriend about it, who talked to another girlfriend about it. The sixth girlfriend in line contacted her father. The father of this girl contacted the police department.
Based on the father's tip, police track down John's former girlfriend, Julie, and bring her to Portland. She agrees to cooperate, and they arrange to tape her phone conversations with John.
He said that he'd strangled his wife. Julie got the impression that the body was buried. We were driving by the metal fabrication plant where John and his younger brother worked. And Julie mentioned that John became very different every time that they went by that area.
But John's confession to his old girlfriend isn't enough. Police still need a body to get a conviction. Lori sees Alexis buried somewhere where John can keep a close watch on her. It makes sense it would be close to where he worked. Following his own intuition and Lori's clues, Detective Lee decides to search the 15 acres beside the plant. Maybe this is the clue 15 Lori keeps seeing.
It has a very, very large metal fabrication building with very little in the way of vegetation. The 15 acres that was right next to it was ideal because the trees and the brush provided an awful lot of cover and concealment. Access was pretty much restricted. We sent cadaver dogs over the 15 acres, and their handlers came back with essentially nothing. I was personally disappointed that we were not able to find the body.
As Detective Lee and I would talk throughout the year occasionally about the case, of course, there would be times when he felt that maybe John was going to crack. And I would just always share with him my philosophy. Everything happens when it's supposed to.
It's a real low point in the investigation. Without Alexis's body, police can't charge John with murder. But Lori is sure John's younger brother Kelly is involved, despite the fact he's given police what appears to be an airtight alibi.
I think Kelly just happened to be the wrong guy at the wrong time, and he was related to the murderer. And so he helped dispose of her body.
Kelly was in Southern California during the specific time frame that Alexis disappeared, and a reasonable person would believe that Kelly could not have had any involvement simply because of the time frames. He was literally over 1,000 miles away at the time.
I generally find what I get as a first impression is correct, and I remember telling him I'm standing by it.
It's been a year since Alexis Burke went missing after an argument with her husband, John. With the case going cold and based on her track record, Detective Lee decides to listen to psychic Lori McQuarrie and take another look at the brother's story.
John essentially has no friends of his own. His best friend in the world is his younger brother. If the younger brother knows anything about it, that would automatically mean that his best friend would know all about the case.
Kelly's friends and former roommates are all law students. They've been interviewed once about the disappearance of Alexis. This time, Detective Lee re-interviews them with a grand jury subpoena in his hand, threatening each with jail time if they refuse to cooperate. From what Kelly's friends have to say, it becomes very clear that Kelly knows something. He's brought in for questioning, and Detective Lee persuades him to cooperate.
He told me everything I wanted to know. Yes, he was in Southern California playing ball, but the game had gotten rained out. He was actually back in Oregon 24 hours earlier than he was supposed to be.
It is a turning point for the investigation. If it hadn't been for Lori's conviction, police might never have re-interviewed the brother, and his information was just what they needed to get an arrest.
Bob Lee does not give compliments lightly, but he did kind of offer that up and say, well, I guess you were right. And I just felt that there was a shift at that point.
The deal we made with Kelly was very simple. We were concerned that because the body had been in the ground for so long that we would not be able to formally identify Alexis Burke. The dental records we had were several years old. We knew there were not going to be any fingerprints. There was not going to be anything that was actually going to tell us for certain that this was Alexis Burke and not somebody else. And that would be a loophole that a defense attorney would be able to drive a truck through. So we essentially made a deal with Kelly that we would not prosecute him in any way, shape, or form for his complete assistance in the case, including showing us where the body was.
I felt that there had been a horrific fight.
Kelly confirms Laurie's original vision of a strangulation. He tells Detective Lee how a family argument escalated into murder.
Alexis walked out the front door, slammed the door behind her. When she got to the car, she didn't have car keys, and she was in her nightgown. So she came back and started screaming at John.
He had big hands. I can just feel these around her neck. I know that's how he murdered her.
He came over to her and put his hands around her neck. John said to shut her up because she was really making a lot of noise. John says he ripped off the electrical cord and tied it around Alexis's neck just to make sure that she was dead. The body was rolled up in the carpet behind the couch for at least 36 hours. During that time frame, that at least 12 members of his family and her family were in the apartment.
When Kelly finally showed up, he helped John dispose of the body just as Laurie had envisioned.
There's a larger car, older car.
They put the body of Alexis into the back of their father's car, which was a very large Lincoln, dark in color. They then took the body out in the middle of the night and actually dug a hole about 75 yards from the corner of the building where they both worked and buried Alexis.
There's water involved and not a large body of water.
The body was right next to a very, very small rivulet of water. The head was the closest to that water, and it was only several feet away. And of course, the body was under just several inches of dirt.
Laurie's visions are accurate about all the important details of the case. The brothers' involvement, the larger car the body had been moved in, Alexis's body buried in a shallow grave near water, and about John keeping an eye on the site.
He was able to keep an eye on the situation because he went there every single day.
But John Burke still isn't in custody. Because he was out of town, he is oblivious to the discovery of the body.
As it was, John showed up the next day and he was totally in the dark, and by the time he found out about it, it was too late. And I told him he was under arrest for the murder of his wife, and I put on a pair of brand new handcuffs on him. That felt really good.
John Burke is convicted of his wife's murder and sentenced to 13 years in jail. His brother Kelly gets off scot-free because he cooperated with police. With this murder solved, Detective Bob Lee isn't quite as flippant about Laurie's psychic abilities.
I contacted Laurie to tell her, all about the case and how terrifically accurate she was at that point on 28 of the 30 things that she had told me.
I don't know if I feel vindicated so much as I just feel, yes, this stuff does work. And it's important for me to be right, not just for me, but I think it's important for the victim.
Psychic Laurie may be good at predicting the future, but not when it comes to herself. Detective Lee was so impressed with her abilities, he proposed marriage.
I never for a heartbeat thought when I met him that I was going to end up with him.
We've been married now for a little over 18 years. We're a good team.
November 1982. Fear cloaks the serenity of a small town in New Jersey. Popular teenager Amy Hoffman has disappeared without a trace. The police can't say if she's alive or dead, but psychic Nancy Weber knows there's been a murder and fears the killer is on a rampage.
He's killed before, he's killing again. He's going to kill more.
She tells me something, I believe it to be gospel.
Can Nancy help catch the killer before his brutality is unleashed again? Three people out for a pleasant afternoon stroll, or so it seems. A closer look, and it becomes apparent this is not a recreational time filler. These people are not so ordinary. The conversation underscores the seriousness of their purpose.
She's screaming for her life and begging mercy.
Right when she was first found, there was no evidence that would indicate it.
Bill Hughes is a police officer, Nancy Weber is a professional psychic, and Jimmy Moore is retired. He was detective captain at the Parsippany Police Department. More than 20 years ago, the trio came together and stood in this secluded location. What happened here would change their lives forever. November 23, 1982. Amy Hoffman, an 18-year-old senior high school student, leaves her part-time job at a Morris County shopping mall. In the parking lot, she says goodnight to her friend. It's approximately 9:35 p.m. Two people see Amy as she walks across the back lot to where her car is parked. One, a fellow worker driving out of the parking lot. The other, her killer.
Well, her vehicle was found in the parking lot, not too far away from the store that she worked in. And the door was open on the car, and there was a witness. And she noticed a white male, in a green Chevrolet that was parked a couple spots away from where Amy's car was. And he was just sitting there in the car at that time.
It's Thanksgiving, 2 days since Amy Hoffman was last seen alive. Morris County, New Jersey comprises several small townships. Police departments from across the region become involved in the search for Amy.
It had a major impact on the community. Women were hesitant about going out on their own, especially at night.
20 miles away in Mount Olive, Nancy Weber, who runs her own psychic practice, gets a phone call from a woman.
She said, my daughter has a best friend who works at the Morris County Mall. And she's missing. She didn't come home. And that's when the vision popped up. The image I kept having was this naked body, multiple wounds all over. She was lying in water, raped. She had been terribly, terribly violated before she was murdered. And so I just went right into saying to her, I am sorry. I really can't discuss this with you. You call Amy's parents, or you call the police that are involved.
That same day, Amy Hoffman's body was found in a retention tank at the reservoir in Randolph.
There was a couple walking their dog through the woods, and it's an isolated area. It's like a lover's lane area. And they came across the body floating in the water. There was numerous slashes and stab wounds to her body. And some were post-mortem, meaning that after she had died, the assailant still continued to slash at her and cut her body. It was pretty gruesome.
Nancy's vision of the dead young woman was accurate. Bill Hughes, a detective with the Mount Olive Police Department, happened to drop by Nancy's house.
Most of the police officers in Mount Olive Township knew Nancy because she was just a friend of a lot of guys on the force, her and her family. And I stopped by, just stopped by Nancy's house, just for a cup of coffee.
By the way, I read the newspaper account of Amy Hoffman. Why are they lying? She was raped. She wasn't not sexually abused. She was mutilated, not no wounds obvious.
The investigators at the time did not believe that sexual assault had occurred, but Nancy said that it had. That the girl had been sexually assaulted. There was no way of knowing because there was no physical evidence that you could see at the scene, according to the investigators, to indicate any type of sexual contact. What we found out later on was, yes, she indeed had been sexually assaulted by the suspect, and that was the result of forensics taken by the medical examiner's office.
I didn't say anything to Bill about wanting to be involved at all. It's one of the things I don't ever do. I wait to be asked. When it comes to this kind of work, it's very important, I believe, for all concerned, including the victim, to know that I am the appropriate person to participate. It's an ingredient. I'm one of the ingredients or not. So I don't ask to help.
Maybe to a lesser extent today, but at that time, psychics were certainly not taken seriously. They probably were looked at as people trying to make a name for themselves, people that would take advantage of the weak. I was a small player in this investigation. I'm on the periphery, so I really had no authority. I had to find somebody that was very open-minded, kind of like myself. You know, I'll try anything once, believe anything once until it's proven wrong.
Detective Bill Hughes has faith in Nancy's psychic powers, and she has a real concern that the killer will strike again.
He's killed before, he's killing again, he's going to kill more.
November 1982, Morris County, New Jersey. 18-year-old student Amy Hoffman goes missing. 2 days later, her mutilated body is discovered in a water retention tank. Police from all across the region are hunting down a brutal killer. On the same day Amy's body is discovered, psychic Nancy Weber has a vision of the crime scene. She knows that the young woman has been sexually assaulted and murdered even before police. Now she suspects the killer will strike again. She's right.
The second victim was a girl named Deidre O'Brien, who worked in a local restaurant and was heading home early in the morning. It was after midnight. She was forced off the road and abducted from her vehicle, and later brought to a rest stop on Route 80 in Warren Township, where she was murdered. We were all very upset because now we had two gruesome homicides on our hands, and we had a feeling that the same individual was involved because the same type vehicle was seen leaving the scene of Deidre O'Brien's homicide.
A second woman dead in such a short time leaves little doubt that police are dealing with a serial killer. But this time, the killer leaves a calling card: tire prints. Detective Bill Hughes thinks it's crucial to get Nancy officially involved in the case, but he is just one of hundreds of police officers tracking down what they now suspect is a serial killer. He needs to get someone he can trust to hear her out.
I knew that Jimmy Moore is a seasoned veteran. Jimmy has well over 20 years on the police force at the time. He's a captain. He's in charge of the detectives in Parsippany. He's more directly involved in the case because Amy Hoffman is from Parsippany. So I knew that if I could talk to Jim, then I might be able to get them to use Nancy to do some investigative leads on the case, or to give us some direction to go in the case.
I had never used a psychic, and I was a little skeptical. I really didn't believe too much into them. Is it possible? I mean, can somebody truly do this? I actually had flashbacks of being on the boardwalk and down at the Jersey Shore, and you see these signs, palm readings, and of course I don't believe in any of that. So I was a little skeptical, but I said, you know what? We have nothing really to go with. If there's a chance that it's going to solve the case, I'm willing to try it.
When I opened the door to Bill at 6'5", standing next to this about 5'7" man who he introduces as Captain Jimmy Moore from Homicide, I thought, uh-oh, what now? And he simply asked me to repeat to Jimmy what I had told him about the newspaper account of Amy Hoffman and my belief that there was a discrepancy there.
I asked Nancy some questions and stuff like that, and pretty much wanted to get to know her as an individual, and I found out that she was a just down-to-earth type of individual, and she didn't seem to be a person that exaggerates or puts anything on. And I was impressed by her personality. And I said, how do you do this? And she says, I just see it. And she says, I don't know why or how, but I just see things. And she says, all I can do is tell you what I see. And she says, I don't want you to tell me anything about the case, and I don't want you to give me any leads.
What we decided to do at that point was take a ride in my car. And what we were going to do is take Nancy by the scenes of the abduction, and the scenes of the murder, and the scenes where their bodies were left.
When I was driving with Bill and Jimmy in the car the first day, when we went down a road, I could feel I was coming towards the end of her life. It was as if the energy of the road itself got darker and darker. Got more magnetically charged with an energy that felt more panicky, heightened anxiety.
The first place that we went to was the reservoir in Randolph. We took Nancy down there and parked the cars, and we let Nancy walk around. It was an eerie feeling. You know, it was a very isolated area, wooded area, no homes around. Very macabre. You could almost feel the horror that Amy would have gone through. Amy could have been dumped in any one of about 12 acres. And Nancy went right to the spot where Amy was left.
I felt almost as if Amy was waiting for me there on the ground. So I got down on the ground on my knees, and I could feel no separation between the memory of what Amy went through and myself at that point. I began to speak words I believed were the last words, where she was begging, please don't kill me. I believe she knew that that's what he was about by then. She had already been raped. She had already been badly cut. And I believe she understood that he was enjoying this. And she didn't know how to get through to him. She had no idea how to get through to this person who seemed bent on destroying her. For me, it was very important to stay with it because I'm looking for the tiniest bit of a clue, a shred of evidence that might stop him. Went back in the car and kept reviewing. Now I'm going over all the film, again and again, like an editor, attempting to be as detailed as possible. Pop. He's from Polish descent. He grew up in Morristown. Pop. He was in Florida. He was in jail there for murder. And I'm telling Jimmy and Bill as I get it, in the car, driving. They let him out. Early parole? Pop. His name kept coming to me, the man who was with her. James. I don't know if she knew his name. I knew it. So when I got the last name beginning with a K and Kadababaich.
I felt that Nancy was seeing what we were looking for. She had this individual pegged, and she was trying as hard as she could to give us as much evidence that she could see to arrest him, because she kept telling me, Jim says, this guy is sick, and he's just going to keep killing until he's caught. And she was upset with that. She was very adamant about telling me that this was a sick individual and he's just going to keep on killing.
It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't he stalked this particular person for weeks and had an obsession with her. He had an obsession with joy at causing harm. When I saw that, I knew he's not going to stop until somebody stops him. This man will not stop.
With 2 brutal murders occurring within 10 days, every available police officer in Morris County is on the case. Most are following procedure, the routine that is police work. 2 are following a totally different line of inquiry. Detectives Jimmy Moore and Bill Hughes have teamed up with psychic Nancy Weber in their own private investigation. They've been able to get quite a bit of information from Nancy about the first murder. Now they want to know what she can tell them about the second.
After the Deidre O'Brien homicide, I picked up Nancy and we drove to the rest area where the crime had taken place.
She took us right to the spot where the suspect had parked with Deidre. She described the encounter there.
And I see this truck in my mind. And I see a trucker, and I see this woman coming out of a speeding car. She's naked. She's knifed. And I'm looking at the car, and I'm looking at... It's the same car. It's James. I know it.
The only thing that stopped him from continuing with his attempt to sexually assault her was the fact that there was a truck parked in the rest area a little ahead of them.
Nancy felt that the assailant had just had enough and didn't want to be bothered with her anymore, so he stabbed her and threw her out of the car and then drove off. And that's when Deidre had enough strength to pick herself up and go to the truck to knock on the door, getting help from the truck driver.
The truck driver got on the CB radio and radioed for help, and troopers eventually got there, but unfortunately, Deidre passed away in the arms of the truck driver.
I was impressed with Nancy when I took her to the truck stop, because everything that she was telling me was exactly what had happened, as much as we knew from the evidence and from the truck driver's statement.
She's telling us stuff that there's no way Nancy could have known, because this is, you know, in the investigative files. This is not stuff that's being released to the press. And yet, Nancy knows what happened.
Over the next few days, Nancy keeps replaying the visions over in her head.
Every time I would go back to James, I would get another tiny little piece. He was at least about 5'10", slim, very narrow, thin, long nose, dark eyes. And I'd spend hours on it. I would be reviewing it, kind of like 18-hour days of review editing. Then I'd go back some more, and I'd feel the car, his brother, gas station. Brother owns it, works it. That's where he got the car, from his brother at a gas station. They're local. They're Wharton, they're Morristown, they're local. They all know who he is. Everybody knows who he is. They'll know his last name. He was a local terror. Growing up even, the cops all know who he is. He's not an unfamiliar character. This guy was dangerous when he was in high school.
Nancy's coming up with all the stuff that she couldn't have possibly known about, and she's giving us all this good information. And then a little bit of frustration sets in because you believe what she's saying, and now you're trying to think to yourself, how am I going to convince the bosses in Morris County to listen to what she has to say?
At this stage, the detectives want permission from the county prosecutor to officially involve Nancy in the investigation, but before they can present their case, they are denied access to his office. The prosecutor is not interested.
As Nancy and I started to walk through the door, a detective from the prosecutor's office stopped me, and who knew me personally, and he said, "Jim, what's she doing here?" I said, "Well, she's been with us and given us information on the case." And he said, "Well, the prosecutor doesn't want her here. He doesn't want to get involved with her." I was upset with the prosecutor for not even hearing us out. I felt that he should have at least listened to what we had to say, and it bothered me. To this day, it bothers me why he did that.
The headlines were all over not only our state, but the nation and on all the news, that we had a serial killer. Nobody knew who it was. They couldn't figure it out.
Nancy is also upset and frustrated. She decides to appeal to a higher authority. She calls some students who she trusts, and they form a psychic circle. Together, they use psychic prayer to try and stop the killer in his tracks.
Went through everything. And when I was finished, I told them, join hands with me. So we went to the light, went to the Godhead, went to the apex, and through that, asked that if it was in the spiritual path of all concerned, to bring back to James K. Itch the pain he has given and the suffering he has caused. Let him feel it now. Let him get it in such a manner he can no longer give it. And I simply held on to that thought the rest of the night. It was my mantra. It was my chant. It is his time. Let him feel his own pain. He cannot give it out any longer. Let him feel his own pain. He cannot give it out any longer. It is over.
The power of divine intervention has been argued and disputed since time began. Can a New Jersey psychic's prayer really stop the killer in his tracks? In fact, there's been a dramatic break in the case overnight.
I get a call home, and I was told that an individual was arrested in response to the Amy Hoffman, Deidre O'Brien murders. They responded to a home in Morristown where an individual had been stabbed. While they were at the scene, one of the officers noticed the green Chevrolet sitting in the driveway, and it matched the description of the vehicle we were looking for. So they called for the forensic team to come to the scene to check this vehicle out. As it turned out, they found the tire on the car matched the imprint that was found at Deidre O'Brien's abduction. And subsequently, the individual was arrested and charged with the 2 homicides. When I found out who the individual was and his background, I couldn't believe how accurate Nancy's information was that she had given us.
So we have our guy under arrest, James Kodadich, and what we find out about James is very interesting. A lot of the stuff that Nancy had told us was right on the money. James Kodadich had a brother who was a mechanic, had lived pretty much his entire life in Morris County. James had moved to Florida, had been in prison in Florida, and that he'd murdered while he was in prison in Florida, stuff that Nancy had come up with. His last name was Kodadich, the K and the ITCH that Nancy had come up with.
Early in the morning, I get a call from Jimmy, and he goes, "Hey, Nancy, what did you do?" I said, "What do you mean, what did I do?" He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I had class last night." And I told them about it. And we said a prayer to finish it. Make this man have all the pain he gave to women. He said, "Well, James Kodadich," and as he said the words and the name, it was like, boom, 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 lights go on. I went, "That's him."
All the information that she saw, that she gave us, was exactly the truth.
I think that a lot of people have to see for themselves. You know, there's going to be people that are going to watch this episode and they're going to see me and they're going to listen to me talk. They're going to listen to Jimmy Moore talk. They're going to listen to different people talking about their experiences with psychics, and they're just not going to buy it. And so be it. But if you're a police officer and you don't buy it, then you probably shouldn't be in the investigative side of anything. I says, because like I said before, you've got to keep an open mind. You've got to be willing to try anything. If you try it and you don't like it and it doesn't work out for you, so be it. Then don't try it again if you don't want to, but at least try it once.
But there is still a mystery surrounding the event of James Kodadich's arrest. Police arrived at his house after he called them complaining he'd been stabbed. Could Nancy's prayer have anything to do with this?
He claimed that a dark-haired woman ran him off the road and knifed him in the back. And at the time, my hair wasn't gray, and it was longish. And I thought, I wonder if he'd recognize me if he met me. I'd love it. I'd love him to know that, you know, you stand there with all the victims. And that victims have power, you fool. How could you do this?
It's up to you to decide whether she had anything to do with it or not.
On October 29, 1984, James Kodadich became the first man sentenced to die under New Jersey's revised capital punishment statute. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. After his arrest, it was determined that Kodadich had actually stabbed himself. He never explained why, although the self-inflicted wounds were not life-threatening, and apparently he never again spoke of the long-haired woman he claimed had attacked him. But perhaps he sees her now and then. September 1975. Two con men swindle millions of pounds and vanish without a trace. The case is going cold until psychic Bob Cracknell has a vision.
They're living in a cave. And they said, where? I said, Scotland.
No one believes him. The police think he's a crank.
You're dealing facts and that's it.
But time is running out. Can the psychic find the con men before their innocent victims lose everything? The strange story of the two preachers who conned millions of pounds begins back in the 1960s, when two respected middle-aged businessmen open a nursing home in the south of England. Jim Miller and John Bellard have been together since university. They are intellectuals, interested in theology. They're also lay preachers, with friends high up in the Anglican Church. Miller is also a holistic therapist. He's clever, charismatic, a natural leader. Bellard is quieter, more reflective. He is the home's bookkeeper. The two men become local benefactors. They help the poor and give to charity. They are well liked in the local community. With the success of the home, Miller and Bellard begin to expand their business interests. They set up a company selling musical instruments and indulge their taste for fast cars by sponsoring racing events. The two men are now living the high life and enjoying every minute of it. Then, in September 1975, the mirror cracks. Miller and Bellard fail to turn up with the prize money at a race they've sponsored. The outcry reaches the ears of Norman Luck, crime reporter with Britain's Daily Express newspaper.
We had a telephone call from a number of people involved in motor racing at Brands Hatch, and they were a bit upset because their sponsor had vanished.
As soon as Luck begins to sniff around, he discovers that the missing sponsorship money is only the tip of a multi-million-pound fraud. Detective Constable David Fickweiler of the Sussex Fraud Squad is already on the case.
They had entered into thousands of finance agreements with various finance companies. The transactions allegedly were for the sale of organs to churches.
In the early 1970s, an electric organ can cost up to £5,000. Churches don't have that kind of money. And finance companies will only lend to individuals. So the charismatic Jim Miller persuades his friends and employees to do a good deed for a church by signing for a loan on their behalf. The church will then repay the loan from their organ fund. Jeff Green was one of the employees who signed for a loan.
You feel that you're in a small selective group that are just helping a few churches out. So on the face of it, that seemed okay.
Except that the churches are completely unaware of their involvement in the scheme. With a signed agreement, Miller and Bellard collect the money for the organ from the finance company, but don't deliver anything to the church.
There were many instances of the same organ being financed several times. So quite obviously it was total fraud.
At first, Miller and Bellard pay back the loans with new loans, so their friends feel reassured that their good deeds are working. And they sign more agreements. Eventually, the con men are forging their friends' signatures to borrow more money. Miller and Bellard end up borrowing over £5 million to pay for organs that are never delivered. When the two men have borrowed up to the limit, the finance companies begin to breathe down their necks, as it is their company supplying the organs. Miller and Bellard throw a farewell party and fly off for a holiday in France. 2 days later, a postcard is delivered saying they arrived safely. That is the last anyone hears of them. Shortly afterwards, Miller and Bellard's friends and employees suddenly find they are about to lose everything they possess if they don't repay the millions they have signed for. The con men have vanished, and the police have no idea where they are. So journalist Norman Luck and Detective Fickweiler decide to pool their resources to try to find them. But after a month, neither have made any progress. Then, one evening, a friend of Luck's suggests he might use the help of a psychic. Psychic Bob Cracknell is keen to use his abilities to help fight the crime.
I think Norman was extremely cynical at the time, you know. He was a hard-bitten journalist.
Bob meets Norman Luck at his home. The journalist shows him some photographs.
I think my first inference was that a church connection. I kept saying, you know, there's a church connection here all the way through.
Bob then surprises the journalist with accurate descriptions of the con men.
Now, this guy, he's the weak one of the two. He's got a gammy leg. And Norman said, how can you tell that from a photograph?
I was skeptical, of course I was. But there was nowhere else he could have got the information from. If he'd done some research on the situation beforehand, then possibly he would have known.
Then Bob's psychic abilities astound the skeptical journalist. He senses a powerful figure at the heart of the scandal, someone high up in the church who is being blackmailed.
I hadn't been told anything about the case, and I said, now there's a bishop involved. Form of blackmail of some description. It's a big fraud, but it's blackmail.
I was rather amazed because I didn't know how the hell he could have known that. That hadn't been released by the police, and it certainly hadn't been released by me.
Had the psychic uncovered the bizarre connection between two fugitive conmen and a blackmailed bishop? Bob doesn't know it yet, but he's about to embark on a journey that will change his life. Two respected businessmen in southern England have vanished after conning millions of pounds from hundreds of innocent people who now stand to lose everything. The police can find no trace of the fraudsters. Psychic Bob Cracknell is sure their whereabouts have something to do with the church. Crime reporter Norman Luck is dubious of Bob's abilities until the psychic mentions a blackmailed Anglican bishop.
He's an astute journalist, but I think the fact that I came up with this one thing, which he said, that's convinced me, nobody else, only I know that, I've only just found it out. And I think he said to me, you were reading my mind.
Luck has been told confidentially by the police of an embarrassing story at the heart of the crime. Miller and Bellard were close friends with an Anglican bishop who was having extramarital affairs.
Miller and Bellard were allowing this senior church person to use a chalet in the grounds for his various dalliances.
So, this is where it all
happened. And this obviously was the secret behind the whole lot.
Yes.
The reason they started the fraudulent transactions was to raise money to pay off what they said were a number of ladies of the night who were threatening to expose their relationship with a former Bishop of Guildford.
They had involved themselves in a financial scam, and with the proceeds, they were helping this senior church person to pay off blackmail demands.
But then the bishop died before repaying the money, leaving Miller and Bellard with a large debt. Could this have been the motive which led two men of impeccable character and no previous record into a life of deception and fraud? Staff at the home give Bob some articles of the men's clothing to see if he can sense their whereabouts.
From the moment I began to touch the items, I was convinced that there was somebody close by who knew where they were. And I said, no, they're not in France. They're here. They've come back.
But if Miller and Bellard are not in France, who sent the postcard? Where have the two men disappeared to? Everything he sees and feels at the retirement home convinces Bob that the two con men are still in the UK.
Right from the start, Bob had this feeling that they hadn't come back to the UK. I don't think I believed it.
And I think that was when Norman got his second shot, when I said, they're here. And they said, where? I said, Scotland, Ullapool.
Ullapool is a fishing village on the west coast of Scotland. Where could the fugitive conmen hide out in such a small place?
The whole thing that was getting me throughout was church. And I'm not talking about the church organs. The connection is with the church. I know it.
Miller and Bellard had always had a religious leaning. Apparently, they had often discussed becoming monks and joining a monastery.
That was possibly the church connection I was looking at. They were in some monastery. They were in some religious retreat.
But there is no monastery in or near Ullapool. Could he have gotten it all wrong? Detective Fickweiler, meanwhile, ransacks the nursing home searching for the money, but finds nothing. Could Miller and Bellard have taken it with them? The police interview everyone close to the conmen. Of particular interest to them is Jeff Green, the manager of their racing sponsorships and one of their most trusted employees.
Well, my impression of Jeff Green was that he was one of those people that thought Miller and Bellard were genuine and nice people, real kindly people, and I think he had been, like everybody else, conned by them.
When Luck and Cracknell visit Jeff Green at his home in Brighton, he insists he knows nothing of the two men's whereabouts.
I thought Jeff Green came over as a fair, as genuine character, that he was just another victim of the Miller and Bellard situation.
After talking to Green, I was totally convinced this man was lying. They were in Scotland. He knew, and he was able to contact them. Norman, however, hard-bitten journalist, stated quite simply, "Sorry, without evidence, we cannot pursue it." I was devastated. What could I do? How could I convince anybody?
Bob now faces a serious problem. How can he prove that Jeff Green knows where the two men are hiding? How does a psychic prove what amounts to no more than a feeling? He has only one option: to get the proof himself. Bob decides to go to the west coast of Scotland to try to find some evidence for what his psychic impressions are telling him.
But I had this absolute conviction of the connection with the church, and I began to think in terms of a church as a retreat. I thought, okay, it's on an island or somewhere like that.
He makes Ullapool his base. From here, he plans to search the islands off the coast. He immediately sets about questioning the hotel staff.
Doing my amateur Seamus bit, you know, have you seen this man or this man or this man? I thought, well, you know, you've got to start somewhere, you never know.
A couple of people seem to recognize the faces, but aren't certain. Bob then sets out to search the islands, showing the photographs to everyone he meets.
One of the ferrymen, I mean, he was quite genuine, and he said, oh, yes, I've seen this guy before, yeah. Quite genuine, you know, which gave me excitement. So I'm beginning to feel that I'm on the track.
Bob's psychic abilities have got him on the trail of the conmen. Will they lead him to their hiding place? But once out at sea, Bob's hopes take a dive. There are over 40 islands off the coast at Ullapool. Finding anyone out there who doesn't want to be found could take years.
With all these islands around you, where do you begin? I can well understand the reticence of the police. I mean, can you imagine? They're listening to a guy who's been labelled a crank saying, an island off Ullapool. Yes, sir, we'll send a man out straight away. It's incredible.
All Bob's psychic feelings about the men's disappearance have had a strong connection to a church or a monastery. So once back on the mainland, Bob decides to explore this link. But the nearest monastery is over 100 miles away at Fort William.
There was two people hitchhiking along the road. So I stopped and gave them a lift, a young couple. They were heading for Glasgow. Something caused me to, for some unknown reason, take the photographs out and say, look, have you ever seen these two guys? And to my absolute amazement, the girl said, oh, yes. recognise them both. Oh, do you remember where you saw them? Yes, at the Royal Hotel in Ullapool. That was it. I was convinced that that was the place. I was right.
The witnesses give Bob the evidence he needs. It seems his psychic powers are right after all. The con men are in Ullapool, exactly where he said they were. But is this enough for the police to catch them? Con men Miller and Bellard have disappeared after defrauding friends and employees of £5 million. The police have no idea where they are. Psychic Bob Cracknell is convinced the two men are hiding on an island off the west coast of Scotland. But no one believes him. So he goes there himself to look for them. And finds evidence that the fugitives are in the area. With renewed confidence, Bob returns to London with the names and addresses of his witnesses. He's sure the police can now catch the con men, and the Daily Express can print the story. But Bob's in for an unpleasant surprise. Back in London, Norman Luck and the Daily Express are not impressed.
That wasn't sufficient proof. You can't say, I think. You've got to either produce a body and say they are staying at so-and-so, so-and-so guest house. We have found the Southern Organ fraudsters. But that didn't happen.
After all his hard work, Bob hits a dead end. No one wants to listen. The con men will get away with it, and their victims will lose everything. His dream of a career fighting crime is fading fast.
I knew that I was right. It became a personal thing, you know. I really didn't know what to do. I'd gone out on this limb, whereas a psychic takes in all forms of vibrations, adverse and otherwise. When a psychic gets depressed, believe me, it's doubly worse.
And then, as the case begins to go cold, Bob receives a final psychic clue about the con men's whereabouts.
I had a dream in which these two guys were living in a cave. In a desolate area, you know, definitely living in a cave. It was such a vivid dream. There was no question of doubt about it. I woke up convinced, as a result, that they had been living in a cave. Well, this is a bothy, as near to a cave as you can possibly imagine.
But the west of Scotland is peppered with these stone huts. How is the psychic going to convince anyone to search them all? Bob phones Norman, but the journalist is away. In desperation, he tells Detective Fickweiler about his dream. But Fickweiler's response to the idea that someone with £5 million would be living in a stone hut is less than enthusiastic.
We deal in facts. And if someone says, I think, I believe, I know things, well, then you ask them what they know. And if they can't come up with anything, why should one waste time pursuing it? Yeah, cynical, sceptical. Yeah, most coppers are. You deal in facts, and that's it.
The police are a funny breed. Unless it's written down or unless they can see it with their own eyes, they don't believe it.
It's now nearly a year since the con men have disappeared. Have they vanished into thin air? The police have exhausted all their avenues of investigation. Yet they still won't listen to a psychic. It'll take a lot more than a dream to convince them that Bob isn't a crank. And then a stroke of luck. Bob's persistence is vindicated. Jeff Green feels let down by his friends and employers, and the pressure from the finance companies demanding repayment has become too much to bear.
I trusted these guys. I thought, they'll be okay, they're going to come back. I know where they are, they're going to come back, they're going to put it all right, and so on. Then, of course, 2, 3 months, 4 months, getting into the 5th month, and nothing's happening. All these wrets are flying. Your health goes down, your marriage breaks up. you're going to lose your house, and this makes you think about it all in a different way.
Green's account of Miller and Bellard's disappearance is extraordinary.
After landing in France, they made their way back on the ferry to Dover, where Jeff Green picked them up, drove them all the way up to the west coast of Scotland. From Ullapool, they set sail in 2 dinghies to an island called Priest Island.
Here was the church connection Bob had tried so hard to find. The 2 men were living in a stone hut on Priest Island, 4 miles off Ullapool. The psychic's powers were absolutely on target.
There's me chasing my backside on islands, connection with the church. Ullapool was the location. I was there. The living in the cave was correct. I believe Norman's headline story was living in a cave, eating cockle soup. But now I would have, I would have gone and got an ordnance map of the whole area and checked it out. And Priest Island would have stuck out like a sore thumb, would it not?
It took us hours to get there, and when we got there, we were thrown up against some rocks because we couldn't control the boat. The seas were too rough. In the end, we were thrown into a small cove.
Green returned home, and the 2 con men, in their 50s, set up camp in the roofless stone hut. They stayed there for nearly 8 months, throughout a sub-zero winter. Perhaps to make amends for the chaos and misery they'd unleashed, the 2 spiritual swindlers simply turned their backs on the world.
They left everybody, and when you leave somebody that trusts you and has great faith in you and wants to still keep you in their lives, it's a terrible thing.
Why should he cover up for these people when he was one of their victims?
When Miller and Bellard ran out of money and provisions, they returned to the mainland and moved into a caravan. They phoned Jeff Green to send them more money. Their lack of contact before that and the fact that he and others had suffered so much in their absence incensed Green. He gave them up. At their trial, both men plead guilty. With no previous offenses, they are given 6 years each. The bishop's wife is still alive, so his name is never mentioned, and the millions, they say, were all spent repaying loans and enjoying a brief taste of the high life.
None of the money was recovered. There was no indication in the books and records as to where all the money had gone.
It seems Bob Cracknell's visions had been right from the start. The con men had returned to Britain from France and hidden on an island off the west coast of Scotland. Priest Island, due to its name, did have a connection with the church, and the 2 men had been living in a primitive stone dwelling, not entirely unlike a cave, and perhaps the pressure, psychic and otherwise, which Bob put on Jeff Green might even have encouraged his confession.
I think that possibly Green said, this guy's not going to let go. I can't take it.
This case changed Bob's life. He became known as the psychic detective and spent the next 30 years fighting crime.
Basically, you are aware of atmosphere, feelings, vibrations that the average person is not aware of. Like a radio, if you like, on shortwave. With all the crackling and noise going along, you've got to go along and tune it in, and bang, you're on the station.
December 1984, Cumru Township, Pennsylvania. The body of a strangled woman is dumped in a ravine. For 20 years, the case of Jane Doe lies dormant until a cop and a psychic join forces.
I started to see lines of light across a map, and I saw the Brooklyn Bridge.
Can a psychic's map locate a killer and solve a 20-year-old murder? small township in rural Pennsylvania, the solving of the Jane Doe case began in an unorthodox way, with an inquiry into the unrelated homicide of a local man. Murder is an unusual occurrence in this community. More unusual is the fact Detective Robert Warner, for the first time in his career, is going to meet with professional psychic Lauren Thibodeau. She has been working with the dead man's family. That's why Warner is here, hoping to find some answers.
I figured I'll use every tool I can to solve a crime. And at this point here, I figured I had nothing to lose, so let's go down and talk to Dr. Lauren and see.
Despite his optimism, Warner is not about to go advertising the visit just yet.
At that time, I didn't know how people would react, so I kept it to myself.
In fact, he didn't even tell Lauren his reason for the visit.
I didn't say anything about that case when I first walked in. She didn't even know I was a police officer. I walked in and sat down, and she knew I was there for a reading. And actually, Dr. Lauren asked me if I was in law enforcement and if I was a police officer, and I said yes.
As Warner hadn't identified himself, there's no way Lauren could have known he was a cop.
That's when she said, well, you're working on 2 cases, and one of them's very old, like put on a shelf for many years. And I was only working on 1 at the time, so I first said, no, I only have 1 case.
I said, no, there's 2 cold cases here, 2. And he said something like, well, I only have this 1, but keep talking. So I did.
This lady's crazy. I'm here for 1 I can't solve. But yes, at first it was like, no way, but when you hear something like that, it's always on your mind now for the rest of the reading. You're picking your brain trying to figure out, what is she talking about? What is she talking about? And then I remembered this other case that we had that I wasn't even working on, and I told her I wasn't working on that, but she said that that's going to be being worked on. She actually saw that one being solved. So at that point there, I was excited.
The second case that Lauren referred to was an unsolved homicide dating back to 1984. That year, as residents of the small community of Cumru Township prepared for the holidays, a body was dumped on the outskirts of town. Discovered 2 days before Christmas, the victim had been strangled and meticulously bound with rope. She was wrapped in a green army-style blanket and wrapped again in a paint-splattered drop cloth. An autopsy revealed that the woman was about 30 years old and had a history of abusing drugs. Forensic investigation, which was still in its infancy, revealed no clues to the killer's identity. With no means of identification, the victim was referred to as Jane Doe, a standard police procedure in the U.S. She was buried in a local cemetery. At the time Jane Doe was murdered, Lauren was a young woman at college living in a different state. Warner was blown away by the fact that Lauren had any inclination about the case.
She's talking about the 2 cases that we have, which floored me. For her to even say that, how does she know that we have 2 cases? And one's been sitting on a shelf for 15 or 20 years. And that's when I contacted her the following day.
It was in that phone conversation that I started seeing green little lights traveling across Route 78. It was as if I was looking at a map of New Jersey, New York, and eastern Pennsylvania. And as it moved across, I looked upward, sort of upward toward the Brooklyn Bridge. And I could feel, and even smell the energy of the city and that we were dealing with, New York.
Lauren was not only able to give a sense of place, she was also able to give some clue as to the killer's occupation.
And I remember asking Detective Rob if one of the people that they thought it might have been could have been a truck driver, because I was shown that this was somebody who would have, I kept seeing the side of a cab of a truck.
So at this point here, I thanked her and left it go at that. I still did not have the case. A few months later, my sergeant had pulled the case out and put it over on my desk and told me, since you're going to be here a while, you might as well start working on this and see what you can do with it.
2 months after Lauren predicted it, Warner was assigned the Jane Doe case. The other case, the murder he went to see Lauren about in the first place, remained unsolved. But for now, Warner focused on the unidentified woman's case. Lauren had also envisioned a truck driver, and sure enough, one of the prime suspects in the original investigation was indeed a truck driver.
Back in '84, there was a truck driver that was going around picking up young ladies with reddish-brown hair, strangling them, and dumping them out of his truck. After they were able to capture the truck driver, he admitted to all the ones that he did. He said he was not in Pennsylvania. There was no way of proving he was in Pennsylvania, so we knew it wasn't him. The actual ligatures were tied differently. At that time, there was no connection.
Did Lauren get it wrong? Was her vision of the truck driver the man who had already been cleared in the case? Or was she right? Was the woman's murderer simply a different truck driver? And the big question, where was the killer right now? Cold cases are notoriously problematic. Memories fade, evidence becomes contaminated, witnesses die.
You got to understand, when the first time that this information came up, I didn't even know Jane Doe's name.
Without the victim's name, there was virtually no chance of ever nailing the killer. But there was one positive to working a 20-year-old crime. Forensics technology had come a long way in the last decade. When Detective Robert Warner started investigating a local murder in Cumru Township, Pennsylvania, he never expected to be hurled back 20 years to an unsolved homicide. Professional psychic Lauren Thibodeau predicted that Warner would be working on an old, unsolved case. Now he was. The case of Jane Doe, a woman who had been strangled, tied up in a blanket, and dumped over an embankment.
Basically what it was it got it fired up in me. And I think my sergeant, when I came back and told him after the reading I had the first time with Lauren about the two cases and so forth, I think it kind of all just went together.
Lauren's vision of the Brooklyn Bridge clearly indicated a New York connection to the case. There was also the map highlighting Route 78, and she sensed that the murderer was a truck driver. As to how psychics see visions, they're all different.
Many people see it visually, others perceive it in a telepathic, auditory way. Others get a real gut sense, they literally have a gut clench. Many people have what I call sort of a field feeling, like from the skin out. They have, the tingles or something. So there are at least 4 different ways people perceive it.
Warner's first challenge was to put a name to the victim. The 1984 autopsy had revealed that the woman was a drug addict, 20 years on. Could this help the police find her real identity? Warner reckoned there was a reasonable chance that she had a criminal record. If that was the case, her fingerprints would be on file. APHIS is the national database of all criminal fingerprints. It didn't exist when the woman was murdered in 1984. Warner submitted her fingerprints, and sure enough, she had been arrested on a minor drug offense.
Match gave me Margaret Calciano and Margaret Gravasi. Gravasi was Margie's married name. She was married for about a year in the 70s. So with those 2 names at that point, I have a computer system where I can go in and I can type in the names in the certain states. And I typed in Brooklyn, New York, and typed in her married name, and I didn't come up with anything. I come up with a few Gravasis. I tried calling, and no one knew Margie at that point. So then I took her maiden name, which was Calciano, entered that in to my system, and came up with probably 250 names in Brooklyn. And the first name I called was her mother.
He says, do you have a daughter named Margaret? I says, yes. I said, who's calling? And he says, I'm a detective from Pennsylvania. And he says, I hate to tell you this, Miss Calciano, but we found your daughter in 1984. And I says, okay. I says, what do you mean found her? He says, well, she was murdered.
For 20 long years, Joan Calciano lived the fear and dread only a mother can comprehend. The sheer horror of never knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. Now, finally, the wait was over.
It was a relief because at least I knew, you know, I knew in my heart she wasn't alive, but I didn't know where she was. You know, and a lot of things go through a mother's mind, you know, and I just thank God she was cut up and never been found, or buried and never been found, and, you know, just so many things went through my mind. But I miss her, you know. She was such a beautiful girl. She could have had anything in life. Yeah, but that was it.
Here's a woman who lost her daughter 20 years ago, and she said the last time she saw her was December 19th, 1984, and she got into an argument with her, slapped her on the face, and she ran out the door, and that was the last she saw her. And it haunted her ever since that was the way her and her daughter split.
The next day, Warner and his partner drove to Mrs. Calciano's apartment in Brooklyn.
She welcomed us in. There were friends and family members there, and we sat around the kitchen table, and we showed her photos just to make sure that she could ID and say that, yes, that's my daughter. Showed her photos from the autopsy.
You know, and we had to ID it, and it was her. And it was hard, you know, to identify her.
And then we got down to brass tacks, and we asked them who was involved in this.
He asked me if I had any idea who killed her, and I said yes. And I gave him the guy's name.
With this information, could Warner find the killer? For almost 20 years, the file on an unidentified female murder victim lay dormant. The Cumru Township Police Department had reached a dead end until Detective Robert Warner met with professional psychic Lauren Thibodeau. Spurred on by Lauren's visions, and with some good old-fashioned police work, Warner was able to identify the woman as Margie Calciano. Margie's family were able to identify who they thought was her killer.
All of them said without a doubt Peter, and they gave his last name of Iosa. Peter was last seen with her. He was, from what the family at that time had told us, he was fatally attracted to her. He would get upset if she was with someone else. He was quite older than her. He was 20 years her senior.
He was obsessed with my daughter, and I knew that he had killed her because he disappeared the same day she did, and that was December 19th.
He supposedly was a very hothead. He would snap, and he slapped her around before.
She was doing coke, and he was giving her money to buy it. And when she needed money, you know, he gave it to her. And he swore nobody would ever have her, you know, and he made sure of that. Yeah.
So we kind of had a good feeling that he was a good suspect. When we left, we just didn't know how to find him. We returned back to our station the following day, and I started working on it, and I couldn't find the last name of Peter Iosa anywhere in New York. I couldn't find it anywhere in the United States.
According to the Census Bureau, there are 555,864 Peters living in the United States. All Warner has to do is find the right one. And all he has to go on are Lauren's visions. A truck, the map with the beam of light, and the Brooklyn Bridge. Warner calls Lauren.
I remember talking to him by telephone not long after about this situation and getting that very visual movie feeling. As he was describing things that he knew about this case, I began to see imagery of a truck driver. Not a big guy, this one. I didn't get a sense of big hulking. You know, on the slender side, definitely a smoker. And I remember seeing the white door of a truck opening, and as if I was looking over the shoulder of the driver stepping out. A thickly quilted sort of plaid, like a flannel, thick flannel shirt that you might wear instead of a coat in wintertime. definitely felt like winter to me. It was very clear that we were at a crisp, cool, almost like could smell lake water near it. And we were at a truck stop somewhere near water. And I guess in this case it would have been the Great Lakes. That region would be on the way. It's almost like a psychic profile of him. I do feel he's a repeat killer. Certainly a lot of sexual violence, you know, rape, assault, that sort of thing.
The revelation that this might be the work of a serial killer, as opposed to a one-off crime of passion, upped the ante for Warner. He was now in a race against time.
We have to get him. We need to get him off the street. If he's killed once and he's going to do it again, and how many has he done in between? It's like any law enforcement officer, anyone actually, that, you know, you want to get this guy off the road, off the streets. He's a danger. There's not a female around that's safe as long as he's out there.
In an attempt to get Pete's last name, Warner phoned Joe Drezick, an ex-boyfriend of Margie.
And he said that he didn't know the name, but he knew that Pete had filed a complaint against him one time, and that the police may have it on record if they'll find it from way back then. So at that time, I contacted New York PD, gave them the information that I had, and they were able to come up with a report and fax it to me in a couple of days, and it came back with Peter Williams.
Warner used Williams' social security number to track the fugitive. He discovered Williams was drawing welfare checks in Milwaukee, and he had been a truck driver, just as Lauren had predicted. One of his main routes had been Brooklyn to Wisconsin, which would have taken him past the Great Lakes. Once again, Lauren's visions proved to be uncannily accurate. With Lauren's help, Warner has gotten this far. He has a name, Peter Williams, and a face. But has he got the hard evidence needed to convict the man he believes murdered Margie Calciano? At any given time, there's well over 20,000 women missing in the U.S. Margie Calciano was just another statistic. And for 20 years, she didn't even have a name. Were it not for the collaboration of Detective Robert Warner and professional psychic Lauren Thibodeau, the chances are Margie would have faded into history as an unidentified victim. The combination of psychic intervention and solid conventional police work produced a prime suspect, Peter Williams.
When I first met Pete and I walked up to him, I advised him who I was and the reason why I wanted to talk to him, and the blood drained from his face. You could see him just literally turn white. He was just pale and became quite nervous. He said the last time he saw Margaret took her to a methadone clinic, and she got out of the car and that was the last he saw her. And he said he washed his hands of her. And those words, when he said I washed my hands of her, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said he didn't deny being intimate with her, but what he did deny was killing her.
Warner needed more than suspicion to nail Williams. He needed hard evidence, and he had it. When he took on the case, all the evidence was resubmitted back to the lab. Improved forensics technology revealed a single hair embedded in the Army blanket used to wrap Margie. To prove it belonged to Williams, he needed to get a DNA sample.
He felt like he had that licked because he wasn't denying having sex with her. What he was denying was killing her. So he was willing to give us the DNA samples. He didn't know we had the hair at that point. And after the fact, prior to leaving, I basically had told him flat out that we felt he's the one that did this. We knew that he probably wouldn't stay in Milwaukee long, and he didn't. He left a few weeks after we were there.
The DNA analysis proved positive. The single hair embedded in the blanket that encased Margie Calciano matched the DNA sample taken from Williams.
When we arrested him in Tucson, he looked at it. He didn't say a whole lot. He didn't say he wasn't guilty at that point. What he said was he read the probable cause and saw the hair. And I think that's what floored him. I think he realized that he he had it at that point.
The DNA profile of the hair recovered from the green blanket matched the DNA profile of Peter Williams. Based on your affiant's investigation, information that your affiant has received in the DNA profile results which were received from mitotyping technologies matching the recovered hair from the green blanket wrapped around the victim and the DNA profile of Peter Williams, I am requesting an arrest warrant be issued for the suspect, Peter Williams.
You do what you gotta do. Huh? A couple of mistakes.
Well,
a couple of mistakes.
Peter Williams was charged with first-degree murder and taken back to Pennsylvania. A month before he was due to face trial, Williams died of cancer. Once again, he had cheated the scales of justice.
I wish we could have gone to trial because I would have rather him been found guilty by a jury. It would have been better for the family and friends that way. It would have been a definite closure.
I felt I was cheated when he killed her and not knowing where she was all those years. And then I wanted to see his face in the courtroom. I wanted him to see me, and which I felt I got cheated again, you know, and it was hard. I mean, I felt very bad. I broke down and cried because I didn't want it to go that way. I wanted him to see me, but it didn't work. So naturally, I felt I was cheated again, you know.
When Margie Calciano had been positively identified, at the request of her mother, her body was exhumed. Today, she is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, just blocks from her mom's home.
And it was funny because when we were up in Brooklyn, we're sitting, and I'm looking at the Brooklyn Bridge, and that's when it dawned on me, and I started thinking about all the things that Dr. Lauren told me that fit. Even though prior to that, it didn't sink in and I wasn't using it, but after I sat there and thought about it, I thought, okay, the Brooklyn Bridge, I just went down the line, and all the pieces started fitting in.
I think where people get stuck is that it's psychic and it must be somehow bigger or more magical than something else, and it's not. It's just a different way of getting information.
You'll get bits and pieces of information. It's all fragmented. And what you have to do is, it's like a puzzle. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you have to sit down and try and place these things into your case. Once you sit down and you can pop in all the pieces, you'll solve your crime.
I would say the best attitude for success is one of very practical, if this can help me solve a case, I'll use it, right? It should be seen as a tool, not as a solution to a case. Psychics do not solve the crimes. The police do that. Where we have help, I think, is sorting out the wheat from the chaff.
Would we have solved the case if I didn't go to Dr. Lauren? It's kind of strange how things work. It's like it's meant to be, you know? It's like things happen for a reason.
Every suspect is innocent until proven guilty. Because Williams died before going to trial, nobody can say for certain if Peter Williams killed Margie Calciano. And there's another twist to the story. Again, because there was no trial, authorities are not allowed to submit Williams' DNA to the national database. So other police officers trying to solve other cold cases will never be able to cross-check Williams as a suspect. So we may never know for certain if and how many times he killed.